Hi, in this video I will be making an epoxy table, but I'm completely broke, so I will have to use every trick in the book and save money on every step. I hope I can teach you some tricks to save money on your projects. Welcome to the cheapo guide to epoxy tables. The first major saving point was this slab. It is a failed project of some random woodworker from Facebook Marketplace. I bought this for $28. So it was really cheap. Now the concept for this table wasn't entirely bad, so a charcoal or a burnt wood table can look really good. But burning a slab of wood is quite difficult because it can warp on you. And probably that's why this is a failed project, because he didn't want to flatten it again and burn it again. So my solution to this is to just take off the top layer. And yeah, that means losing the char as well, but then I will have a nice and flat table that I can make something out of for really cheap. And by no way am I an expert at selecting wooden slabs for table making, but this just seemed like a steal. I mean, it was so cheap compared to other 150 years old oak slabs. What I did make sure, however, is that it was properly dried, so I tested it with a moisture meter, and I also let it acclimatize to my shop's atmosphere for about 6 months. The first step in the process is going to be cleaning up all the little cracks that are in this wooden slab. And this is a long and arduous process, but it's really important, because when I move on to pouring the epoxy into the cracks to fill them up, then these loose pieces of charcoal could float up to the top and could produce a lot of bubbles. That's why I need to remove every single thing that can come loose with some poking. After getting rid of all the loose charcoal, as you can see I have a nice little pile collecting on the floor of my workshop, I need to move on to filling all the gaps. And epoxy is pretty expensive. It's like 5 times more expensive than the entire wooden workpiece. So I'm going to have to use some innovative ways to fill these cracks, because they will require a lot of epoxy. This is my entire supply of epoxy. Approximately $100 worth of epoxy, so about 3.5 liters. To fill this table, I will need 4.5 liters. So I'm going to have to come up with some innovative solution. The first step with the epoxy is going to have to be to stabilize the wood. And this is super important, since the charcoal is quite soft. You can press on it with your fingernail and you can still break some chunks off. I was really careful in the cleanup process, but unfortunately there are obviously still some softer spots. That's why I need to coat the entire surface with a tiny amount of epoxy and leave it to dry to stabilize the wood and to make sure that everything sits and stays snug. I mixed up 300 grams of epoxy, so that leaves me with about 3 liters left, approximately. And as you can see, as I'm painting it on, the wood is soaking it up. And that is what I want. I want all the little pores of the charcoal to be filled with epoxy and to harden and stabilize, so that it will be as hard as the wood surrounding it. In the future, I definitely want to try my hand at making an entirely charred wooden table. And that will require a lot of epoxy and a lot of money. So that's definitely in the future. But for now, I'm going to have to stick with working with failed projects and cheap slabs of wood. But I don't want to downplay the value of this oak cookie too much, because it is 150 years old and the grain on it looks pretty amazing in my opinion. Even though there are a bunch of imperfections on the wood, if you invest enough time into it, then you can make it look beautiful. So that's the plan, trying to save money by investing a bit more time. And it's going to take a bunch of time, since this deep pour epoxy dries in about 5 days, and I will have to do a lot of pours of this deep pour epoxy. That means that this project is going to take approximately a month in only waiting time. The drying time in this case is actually a good thing, It leaves the wood enough time to soak up the epoxy, and when you drag your hand across it, it leaves it completely unstained. And it also stabilizes these small pieces that are on the side, so it's pretty strong. Unfortunately, on the other side, the garbage bag that I used to protect my table kind of gave it a weird texture on this bottom side, but that will be removed in the coming processes. Next, you can see me adding some silicone around every single crack to seal them up as I prepare for the main pour of this project. And I was really nervous because on my last table build, which was actually my first table build, I had a lot of leakage. So that's why you can see me adding a bunch of silicone. The plan is to kind of create sections in which a failure can happen, but it won't be detrimental. So it won't drain all the epoxy that I poured into the piece, and it will hopefully only fill one section. I'm also adding a bead of silicone around the entire underside of the table, so this should stop everything from leaking out from underneath. But obviously I have to seal up all these cracks that are on the side of the wood. And here you can see me using the technique that I developed in my previous video to kind of seal in these weird geometries. This actually saves a lot of money on mold making. Since a sheet of melamine is pretty expensive to me, I opted to use hot glue, and this is way cheaper. By kind of gooping it up on the sides and then adding some sealant on top of it, it actually seals the wood on the sides perfectly. The reasoning for the hot glue is to create an elevated surface for the sealant to stick to. If I were to just put the sealant on the wood, then it would probably go inside the cracks, and that is a really hard fix. So that's why I opted to use hot glue and then sealant. So let's move on to the first pour. I mixed up about 800 grams of epoxy, and I am pouring a very thin layer onto the bottom side of the table. At least it's the bottom for now. And then I'm going to be adding some wooden inserts into every single crack. This way I will save a lot of money. But first, let's check if the table is leaking. It looked great around every single crack except this one. So I'm adding some brown sealant onto the side, and hopefully this will become invisible, or else I'm just gonna have to scrape it out. After letting it dry for 5 days, I make sure that it is actually dry by removing it out of my bucket, and yeah, it turned out pretty good. It didn't leak, at least I didn't lose that much epoxy, so now it's on to filling the gaps. The plan is to add some wooden inserts into every single crack that is on this wooden cookie, and for that I'm creating a stencil out of paper for all of the cracks. The next step is to trace it with a pencil, cut it out with some scissors, and then cut them out from plywood. Probably one layer of plywood won't be enough for that much savings, so I need to cut them out about 3 times. And this will probably save me about 1.5 or 2 liters of epoxy, which is a bunch of money. So if you're broke like me, I think that this technique could work for you too. Since I added a black layer of epoxy onto the bottom of the table, and I'm also going to be doing that to the top of the table, and the plywood is going to be sandwiched in between 2 non-transparent black epoxy layers, it will be completely invisible. At least that's the plan. But the drying time will be greatly increased. If I just did 1 pour, then I would only have to wait 5 days. But if I do 3 pours, then that means 15 days at a minimum. And since I am not a machine and cannot work every single day and night, I probably have to estimate at about 20 days of waiting time. And that is a significant investment in time, but a significant saving in money. That's what I'm aiming for. After a bit of sanding and a bit of corrections on my templates, I managed to fit every single piece perfectly into its respective place. I did this 3 more times, so I totaled at about, I think, a day's worth of work for all these cutouts. In total, the current thickness of this table is about 10 centimeters. The plywood's thickness is about 1.8 centimeters, so adding 3 layers of plywood into the center saves me about half the thickness of the table, which is a great saving. I will add about 3 centimeters of black epoxy to make sure that the plywood will be invisible. In total, the plywood was about 800 grams that I've cut out, and calculating with the density of the plywood and the density of the epoxy, that saves me about 1.5 to 2 liters of epoxy, which is a bunch of money for me. So, pretty good, eh? So, let's move on to the second pour. I mix up about 800 grams 2 times, and I mixed it really black to make sure that the plywood will be invisible in the center. You can see how much of a cheapo I am by not investing in a drill bit for mixing epoxy. Yeah, they don't cost that much, but if you're doing 3 pours, then you can't reuse the drill bits, then a wooden spoon just makes more sense. And whereas if you mixed it with a drill bit, it would take about 3 minutes. When you mix it with a wooden spoon, it takes about 30. I'm willing to make that sacrifice for a bit of saving in money. I skipped ahead to the third pour because it's basically the same thing, but I mixed up some black epoxy and poured it on after letting the second layer dry. In total, I think that I used about 2.8 liters of epoxy, so that leaves me with a couple hundred grams left. And that will come in handy when I need to fix all my mistakes that I've made. Now for the always stressful part of trying to break it loose from the mold. And thankfully, this epoxy tape worked like a charm, and I was able to remove the table quite easily. Now let's check if my silicone grid actually did its job. And for the most part, yes, these grids are completely dry and the cracks are filled from the bottom side. But there were some spots where the epoxy leaked underneath. And thankfully the loss was minimal, so I saved a bunch of money again. Very cool. Now it's on to flattening it again. So I flatten both sides and remove all the material that was left on the top. And unfortunately my router bits are quite dull at this point, so that's why you can see a lot of burn marks. But sanding is way cheaper than routing, so I bought some more sandpaper and I'm going to put in some elbow grease in sanding away these burn marks that were left by the router. I really need to figure out a better solution for routing because I cannot deal with these burn marks happening every single time that I'm doing some routing in the workshop. I was pleasantly surprised at how good the underside of the table turned out to be, because I didn't really care that much about the natural side of this wood and I wanted to capture some of that burnt aspect, but it actually turned out pretty okay looking, at least in my opinion. So the next step will be to remove all the little surface imperfections that are on the top side of the wood. And as you can see, there are a bunch of burn marks, but there are also some inconsistencies in my routing. So that's why I put on a really aggressive sanding belt on my belt sander and got to work. Not building a mold for the entire table has a few issues associated with it. It saves a bunch of money, yes, but it doesn't flood the entire table, and that's why all these little gaps will be left on the surface of the wood and they will need to be corrected. So that adds another 5 days per side of wait time for the epoxy to dry. And this is going to be the next step after I finish sanding both sides of the workpiece. I am actually quite impressed that it didn't leak anywhere and I managed to conserve the epoxy that I had, but the next step is going to be critical to fill in every single tiny gap, and to make sure that the finish will look even, I don't want to have any major spills on the top of the table. But before I can do that, I need to sand the other side flat as well. And as you can see, my router bit was really struggling with this because lots of epoxy was poured on top, and yeah, the router really doesn't like kind of taking away epoxy material. So that's why you can see all of these burn marks. It looks absolutely hideous, but the belt sander fixes it up real fast. Now I need to fix up the sides before I can pour on the top, because I want to make sure that the sides actually turned out okay and that I don't need to do any corrections here. So you can see me using a blunt screwdriver to not dig into the wood, and I remove all the silicone and all the dried hot glue that were used to seal the cracks. And it peels off pretty easily. On some places I did a better job than others, but I think that I can work with this and no major corrections will be needed on the sides. You can see this looks pretty gnarly, so I'm just going to have to use an aggressive wood file and kind of chisel away at the epoxy. And after like 20 minutes of filing, it turns quite smooth, but not smooth enough to apply finish, so lots more sanding needed on the edges as well. I cannot use my belt sander on the sides, obviously, since it would sand them flat. And since this is a round table, or at least round-ish, I need something that can match the curves of the table. And for that, I'm going to be using a nylon wheel. The nylon wheel works pretty okay, but it isn't the best tool for the job, because it leaves a really rough surface, and lots of hand sanding will be needed after, during the finishing sanding. But as you can see, it works pretty okay for removing these large chunks of silicone and remaining hot glue that were on the sides of the wood. In woodworking, you really have to trust the process, and I know that sounds cliché, but the workpiece that you're working on kind of fluctuates between looking beautiful and looking disgusting, then looking beautiful again, then looking disgusting again. So in between the sanding steps, there's always that point where you're wondering, is this even gonna look good? Am I going to be able to sell it? Or what am I gonna do with it when I mess it up? And thankfully, with this piece, the sanding revealed the wood grain and it looks really nice. And hopefully, after these corrections, I can actually make a table that will sell. This is not the most premium slab of wood. As you can see, there are lots of bug holes on the sides where the wood was soft and all sorts of insects got into the wood. But I'm informed that it has been kiln dried and then burned, so hopefully no one is alive in it. At least that will reveal itself pretty fast as I am filling up these holes with epoxy. And I'm sure that the bugs living inside the wood, or the bugs that would have lived inside the wood, wouldn't like being covered in epoxy, so they would come out the sides. But they didn't, so it's all good. By the way, this is my second epoxy and wood table. So if you're seeing something that I'm messing up, or if you think that some technique could be improved, then please leave a comment and I will make sure to read every single one of them. I may not reply to every one of you, but I do read every single comment as it pops up in my notification feed. This wasn't the easiest project to find as a beginner woodworker, but it was one of the cheapest projects to find, so that's why I chose it. It wasn't easy because the wood is a weird shape, so you would need to build an elaborate mold to fill the entire thing, and also it is burnt wood. So those two factors really make the project more challenging, but it is also a bit more fun. I kind of like these hard challenges and I like jumping into deep water, so that's why I chose it. The reasoning behind choosing a hard project to start with and to learn woodworking with is because you can skip the learning curve, or you can kind of jump around on it and learn lots of different things at the same time. Obviously, you need to pay way more attention and you're going to make way more mistakes this way. However, I think that you can learn way more with one difficult project than with 15 easy ones. So that's my philosophy on learning any sort of creative or skill-based trade. Okay, let's get the commentary back on track. Here you can see me filling up all the tiny imperfections that were left with some CA glue and then leaving them dry out in the sun. After sanding these tiny imperfections down, I can move on finally to finish sanding. First, I pop the wood grain again and then use 4 different grits of sandpaper, starting out with 80, then moving on all the way to 240. And bringing this table out into the sun was a good idea until about, I think, 11 o'clock, because I started working at around 8 and it was pretty cold outside. But after a while, the sun started to shine really intensively onto the wood, and this made the epoxy bulge up a bit. And as I was beginning the finishing sanding process, I noticed that the epoxy was getting sanded way more than the wood around it. And I absolutely panicked, so I took the workpiece inside right after this shot and continued finish sanding on the inside. I'm not going to show you the entire sanding process, but the basic concept is you sand with one grit really carefully and really slowly around the perimeter and around the inside of the wood. Then you pop the wood grain after cleaning up all the dust that was left by the previous grit, and then you move on to a finer grain. Since I'm going to be using a hard wax oil to finish this table, I don't need to go that fine. So the manufacturer recommends around 180 grit as the final layer. But I like to add a bit more shine to my tables, so I move on to 240. And with 240, there's a bit different technique involved when applying hard wax oils. Since the fine sanding particles fill the pores of the wood, you need to let the hard wax oil sit on the top of the wood piece way longer than you would if you had only sanded to 180 grit. And that's why I'm going to be leaving it on for at least 30 minutes and then wiping it off. By the way, I didn't just hand sand the entire side of the table because it looks way too smooth for that, so I did actually use my belt sander, being really careful not to cause any flat spots to appear, so that's why you could see that the texture was really fine on the sides of the table. This is going to be my finishing setup. I'm covering 2 of these angled wooden pieces with some packing tape and then laying the wood on top of it. This way the table will only touch in 2 small lines and that won't ruin the finish. So if I had just laid it down on top of the cardboard, it would kind of imprint the texture of the cardboard onto the table, and that is really not what I want. For the choice of hard wax oil, I'm going to be using Rubio Monocoat, recommended by literally everyone on YouTube, so let's give it a try. This stuff is super expensive. That's why I mixed up only a very small amount, because that's what I've heard, that you need to apply only a small amount to each side of the table, and then you need to wipe it off. So I want to minimize my losses as much as I can. During the sanding process, you get to see these glimpses of what the table will actually look like, so the colors of the table kind of reveal themselves. But finishing it is always the most fun, because you get to lock in those colors and you get to define all the beautiful wood grain that was previously hidden. On my previous table, I kind of messed up the finishing process because I decided to buff in the finish by hand. But this time I actually looked up a tutorial on YouTube and I found that you actually need to use a Rotex sander and a felt pad. That is basically just a piece of fabric that I cut out of some polar material and then buff in the finish. And this leaves a way more consistent and way shinier look to the table. After flipping the table, it was time to finish the other side. And at this point I realized that I may have been overly cautious with the amount of finish that I mixed up. This is a huge issue, because if I let this layer of finish dry and then come back like an hour later and finish the other parts that were left out, then the finish will be uneven and you will definitely be able to notice it. So I scurried and I mixed up a second batch of Rubio in about 2 minutes, hoping that I could blend the finish in to create an even surface. At first I got scared because the 2 parts of the finish really didn't seem to blend, but after getting out my Rotex sander and blending it in, thankfully everything turned out great looking. Unfortunately, I cannot use my sander to buff in the finish onto the sides, so I'm going to be using a microfiber towel, which I've soaked in the finish and then applied quite rigorously onto the sides, and hopefully this will create an even texture. Since I've sanded the entire table with 240 grit, I need to leave the finish on to dry for 20 to 30 minutes, as opposed to leaving it on just for 10 minutes when you finish it with 180 grit. After that, I come in with some paper towels and wipe them off. And that's it, finished, right? Wrong. There's one mistake, and it's a pretty bad one. I've just noticed this, but there's a huge air bubble in one of the epoxy pores. And this cannot stay like this. I have to fix it. And fixing it after finishing is going to be a real hassle. So let's get to fixing this mistake. I got out my Dremel and kind of eased into this bubble from the surface of the wood. And thankfully the bubble wasn't very deep underneath the surface, so I could get through in a matter of seconds. However, I had to pay extra careful attention to not touch anywhere else on the table because it would ruin the finish. And the finish is already ruined, I know, but I can still fix it if it's only localized in a very small area, such as this bubble. Next, I'm going to have to clean out the bubble from the inside. And for that, I just use my vacuum and a toothbrush to kind of scrape out all the gunk that was left in there. I then mixed up some epoxy and decided to pour it in. When fixing these precise mistakes, having a steady hand is really important. So I took my time and filled the bubble in drop by drop. Even though I was being really careful, I did manage to spill a drop. But that wasn't that big of an issue, since epoxy really doesn't like to stick to shiny or finished surfaces, so I know I could remove it after it had dried. In the meanwhile, I started work on the legs. I bought 3 pieces of this oak square stock and wanted to try out some Japanese joinery. I'm not that proficient in joinery, but I have these Japanese joinery saws which I love to use, and I think that I can get a pretty okay result for my current skill level. So let's get to it. First, I cut all 3 square stock pieces to length, and then I marked their center out where I want to have lap joints on each of them. What I want to achieve is a 3-way lap joint, and I think that it is a pretty difficult task, but with my Japanese saws anything is possible. And I did actually use this Japanese saw, even though you can see the table saw there, but I wasn't precise enough, so I had to use a lot of sanding and a lot of rasping to make everything fit tightly. But after assembly, it looks awesome. One of the best features of 3-legged tables is that they will always be sturdier than 4-legged ones. But still, I wanted to increase the surface area where the table and the legs connected, and also where the legs and the floor connected. So I cut off each little triangle on the end of the legs. In the meanwhile, the epoxy has dried and it was time to fix up my mistake. I bent this razor's edge to create a curved knife, and I kind of chiseled away at the puddle of epoxy that was on the surface of the wood. After a while, I moved on to sanding with a hard grit and then a softer grit, and then blended in all the sanding marks. After that, I went in with a wet paper towel and checked my work. And thankfully, the mistake was completely erased and it turned almost invisible. But nothing is for sure yet. I have to wait to see the final result after the second coat of finish. So I prepped my workshop and the workpieces once more and poured in a generous amount of Rubio, like 5 times as much. And even though this may be a bit wasteful, I didn't want to run into the problem again where I run out of finish before I have actually coated the entire workpiece. At first, I believed what the can says, that it is really monocoat, so 1 layer of finish should be enough. But since I've had that mistake, I wanted to apply a 2nd layer to everything. And the difference is really visible. Like, the satin shine of the entire table looks way nicer with this 2nd coat added. Unfortunately, as of yet, I have not figured out how to ship my pieces over long distances, so that means that I can only sell locally in Central Europe. But if you would like to support the channel and the work that I do, the best thing that you can do is subscribe to the channel and like this video. With that said, this was a really challenging project, but it was also insanely fun. I learned so much about using epoxy and the finishing process, and also fixing these really weird kind of hiccups along the way. Especially that last one. That one really stung. However, all in all, the easy part is done. Now for the most difficult part. Actually monetizing my creativity and trying to sell the stuff that I make. And yeah, I need to improve on that a lot, because a business really doesn't function when you don't have any cash coming in. So it's kind of a passion project at this point, but I don't seem to find the point where I can turn my hobby into a business. Anyway, I'm still figuring that out, and hopefully in the future I will be a bit more successful in this endeavor. With that said, let me show you the beauty shots of the table.